The storm had rolled in without warning, turning the streets of New Seattle into rivers of neon-reflected water, and Jake Morrison ducked under the awning of his apartment building, shaking droplets from his jacket, and that was when he saw her sitting there against the brick wall, soaked to the bone with clothes that looked strange and shimmering even in the dim light. And her skin had an odd luminescence to it, pale blue undertones that no human possessed. And Jake's breath caught, because he had seen the news reports about the alien refugees who had arrived 3 months ago. But he had never encountered one up close like this before in his entire life. And the girl looked young, maybe 20 in human years, though Jake had no idea how their aging actually worked in reality, and her eyes were large and silver like mercury, tracking him with obvious fear written all across her delicate features, and she was trembling badly. Whether from cold or terror, he could not really tell at all in that moment. And Jake said softly, while keeping his distance from her, asking if she was okay and trying not to scare her any further than she already seemed to be right now. And she did not respond at all, just pressed herself harder against the wall like she wanted to disappear into it completely. And her lips, tinged with purple, moved slightly, but no sound came out of her mouth at all, and Jake glanced around quickly to see the street was empty, because everyone sensible enough had stayed inside during the terrible downpour that was happening right now. And he thought about the half-eaten pizza in his apartment upstairs that was still warm in its box, and he thought about walking away, minding his own business like everyone else in this city always did without fail. And instead he took a slow step forward and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. And he said he was not going to hurt her, and that she looked hungry. And he had food upstairs, and real food, not whatever she might eat. But it was pizza with cheese and bread and tomato sauce, and it was good food that humans ate all the time. And the girl's silver eyes studied him for a long moment that felt like forever to Jake. And then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded just once, and Jake led her upstairs to his modest apartment, acutely aware of the water trail they were leaving in the hallway behind them. And once inside, he grabbed a towel from the bathroom and offered it to her with a gentle gesture, and she took it hesitantly, dabbing at her face with movements that seemed too careful, too measured, like she was thinking about every single motion before making it. And Jake said she could sit wherever she wanted and gestured to his worn couch that had seen better days. And he said he would get the pizza for them to share. And he returned from the kitchen to find her perched on the edge of the couch, with the towel clutched in her lap like a security blanket. And Jake set the pizza box on the coffee table and opened it up wide, and he said she should help herself, and he promised it was safe because humans ate this all the time without any problems. And the girl stared at the pizza, as if it were the most complex puzzle she had ever seen in her life, and slowly, she reached out and took a slice, holding it delicately between her fingers like it might break, and she sniffed it carefully, then took the smallest possible bite she could manage, and her eyes widened in what looked like surprise or maybe delight. And Jake smiled and asked if it was good and took a slice for himself to show her it was safe, and she took another bite, larger this time, and nodded vigorously with enthusiasm showing on her strange but beautiful features, and for the next few minutes, they ate in companionable silence that felt comfortable, despite the strangeness of the situation, and Jake watched, as the tension gradually left her shoulders bit by bit, and as color slowly returned to her strange and beautiful features that fascinated him more than he wanted to admit to himself. And when half the pizza was gone between them, the girl finally spoke for the first time, and her voice was melodic and accented in ways Jake could not place at all, and she said thank you, and that she had not eaten in 4 whole days, and Jake nearly choked on his pizza in shock, and asked why, not and whether there were not refugee centers available for her people, and her expression darkened considerably. And she said refugee centers were monitored carefully, and she could not go there at all. And Jake asked why not with genuine curiosity and concern, and she set down her pizza slice carefully and met his eyes directly and said, because her people were not what his government thought they were at all, and if they knew the truth about everything, they would kill them all without hesitation or mercy. And Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with his damp clothes sticking to his skin. And he asked what she meant by that statement, and the girl was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather her thoughts, and then she said her name was Vera, and if he truly wished to know everything, she would tell him the complete truth, and but once he heard this information, He could not unhear it ever again, and his life would change, forever in ways he could not imagine. And Jake thought about telling her to stop right there and showing her to the door, and forgetting this ever happened to him tonight. And instead, he leaned forward and said he was listening to whatever she had to say. And Vera wrapped the towel more tightly around her shoulders and began to speak in a steady voice. And she said they were called the Kalari people. And when they arrived on his world, they told his leaders that they were refugees from a dying planet and survivors of a great war. But that was not entirely true at all. And Jake set down his pizza because his appetite was suddenly gone completely. And he told her to go on and explain everything, and Vera said her people were not refugees at all but scouts instead. And for the past 300 years, the Kalari Empire had been expanding across this sector of the galaxy without stopping. And they identified worlds with valuable resources and established a presence there. And then the fleet would arrive to take over. And Jake said flatly that it was an invasion force, and Vera said yes, but not in the way he might think it worked. And she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city below them, and she said the Kalari did not conquer through military might alone, but they were infiltrators and adapters who studied a species carefully and learned their weaknesses and their fears and their vulnerabilities, and then they exploited them from within their own society. And Jake's mind raced with the implications, and he asked how many of them were here on Earth right now. And Vera said on Earth there were 3,000 who arrived in the initial group, but more came every week, hidden among merchant vessels and cargo ships, and by now, perhaps 10,000 total were on the planet. And Jake asked if the government knew about this. And Vera turned back to face him directly and said his government knew there were Kalari on his world. But what they did not know was that they were not all refugees at all, and many of her people were here willingly, carrying out their mission by mapping defenses and identifying key infrastructure, and befriending those in positions of power and influence. And Jake stood abruptly and started pacing across the small living room, and he asked why she was telling him this, because he could go to the authorities right now with this information, and Vera agreed he could do that, but said he would not do it. And Jake asked how she knew that for certain, and she said because he gave her food when she was starving, and he offered kindness to a complete stranger when he had no reason to do so at all. Vera moved closer to Jake and said she was not trying to manipulate him right now, and this was exactly what her people did to others. And Jake laughed bitterly and said she was trying to manipulate him at this very moment, and this was what she said her people specialized in doing, and Vera said no firmly, and that she was telling him the truth because she needed his help desperately, and she was not like the others of her kind at all. And she did not want this invasion to succeed against humanity, and that statement stopped Jake in his tracks completely, and he asked what she meant by that. And Vera's composure cracked for the first time, and he saw genuine emotion flood across her alien features, and it was fear mixed with desperation. And she said she was raised to be a scout and trained from childhood to view other species as resources to be harvested for the Empire. But since coming to Earth, she had seen things that changed her completely, and she had watched humans care for each other and sacrifice for strangers and create beauty for no purpose other than joy itself. And she said his people were chaotic and flawed in so many ways, but they were also remarkable in ways her people had forgotten. And she took a shaky breath and said she did not want to be part of destroying his world at all, and so she ran away and left her assigned position and abandoned her mission completely, and she had been hiding for 2 weeks, trying to figure out what to do next, and Jake studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or lies, and he asked her to assume he believed her story, and what exactly did she think he could do about an alien invasion anyway, and Vera said she had information that could help, and it included names and locations and communication protocols and everything his government would need to identify the infiltrators and stop them before the fleet arrived in several months. But she could not go to the authorities herself because they would never trust her at all, and she was the enemy in their eyes, and Jake asked if she thought they would trust him instead. And Vera said no, but he could get the information to someone who would listen carefully and someone with the power to act on it. And she pulled something from her pocket, and it was a small device that glowed with internal light that looked alien and advanced. And she said this contained everything and data she had been collecting secretly at great risk to her own life, And Jake stared at the device in her hand and asked how he knew this was not just another manipulation and that she was not playing some deeper game with him, and Vera admitted he did not have any way to know for certain, and he had no reason to trust her except that she was asking him to trust her now, and she said she was betting her life that the human who offered her pizza in the rain was the same human who would do the right thing, even when it was absolutely terrifying to do so, and the apartment fell silent except for the drumming of rain against the window outside, and Jake looked at this strange girl carefully and this alien scout who claimed to be a defector, and he tried to make sense of everything she had told him, and finally, he held out his hand and told her to give him the device, and then she was going to tell him everything in complete detail and every single fact. And if he was risking his neck for this mission, he wanted to know exactly what he was dealing with. Here. And Vera placed the device in his palm gently, and Jake felt its warmth through his skin like it was alive somehow. And he asked where she wanted to start explaining. And Vera said the beginning would be best. And Jake settled back onto the couch and told her to tell him about her people and tell him about this empire, and tell him why she was really willing to betray them all. And Vera sat beside him on the couch and began to speak in a steady voice. And over the next several hours, Jake learned more than he had ever wanted to know about the Kalari Empire and its long history. And Vera spoke in careful detail, sometimes pausing to find the right words in English because it was not her native language, and sometimes sketching diagrams on the notepad Jake provided for her, and the Kalari were ancient. She explained carefully, and they were a civilization that had mastered interstellar travel before humans had even invented the wheel for transportation. But their success had come at a terrible cost over the centuries, and centuries of expansion had drained their homeworld of all resources, turning it into a hollow shell of what it once was. And now they moved from system to system like locusts, taking what they needed and moving on to the next target. And Vera said quietly, they were very good at it, and they had consumed 47 worlds in the past 1,000 years of expansion, and Earth would be the 48th world to fall. And Jake asked if no one had stopped them successfully, and if no other species had fought back against them. And Vera said some had tried to resist, and the Thorians mounted a resistance that lasted 30 years but failed, and the Zelnari destroyed 3 of their scout ships before the Kalari adapted their approach. And Vera's expression was distant and haunted, and she said, but they always won eventually because they were patient and they were thorough and they had no mercy for anyone. And Jake glanced at the small device sitting on his coffee table and asked what exactly was on that thing. And Vera said everything was on it, and the complete roster of Kalari operatives on Earth, organized by region and city, and communication frequencies and encryption codes were included, and details of the infiltration plan were there, including which human officials had been compromised already. And Jake asked how they were compromised. Exactly. And Vera hesitated for a moment and said through bribery or blackmail or other means, and some of her people were capable of limited telepathic influence and not mind control exactly, but gentle persuasion that made suggestions feel like the subject's own thoughts. And Jake felt his stomach turn at the implications, and he said that was horrifying to think about. And Vera agreed simply, and said yes, it was. And that was why she could not continue with the mission. And she said she watched a Kalari operative befriend a human woman and gain her trust completely, and use her to access classified military installations, and the woman thought they were genuine friends, and she had no idea she was being manipulated like a puppet. And when Vera saw the way she smiled at him with complete trust, and the way she trusted him completely without any doubt, and Vera's voice cracked with emotion, and she said she realized they were monsters doing terrible things. And Jake said quietly that not all of them were monsters, and she was here trying to stop it all. And Vera asked what difference one Kalari could make against 10,000 operatives and against an entire empire. And Jake picked up the device and turned it over in his hands and said, maybe a big difference if they played this situation right. And he asked how high up the compromised officials went in the government, and Vera listed several names that made his heart sink, and she said, Councilman Gregory Hayes in the Planetary Defense Committee and Admiral Patricia Cole in the Space Fleet, and Senator Daniel Price were compromised, and she listed several more names, and each one made Jake feel worse, and she said they did not know they were being influenced at all, and they believed their decisions were their own completely. Jake muttered that this was completely insane and he was just a data analyst for a shipping company, and he was not equipped for this kind of dangerous situation at all. And Vera said quietly that he knew someone who was equipped for this. And Jake looked up sharply and asked what she meant by that statement. And Vera said when he let her into his apartment earlier. She saw a photograph on his shelf and it showed him with a woman in a military uniform. And they were smiling together and looking close like family. And Jake followed her gaze to the framed photo of him and his sister Katie. And he said that was Katie, and she was a lieutenant in Earth Defense Intelligence. And Vera said, then she was perfect for this mission. And Jake said to wait a moment and stood up quickly and said he was not dragging his sister into this dangerous situation, and if what Vera was saying was true, then the people Katie worked for were compromised and going to her could get her killed easily. And Vera countered that not going to her would get everyone killed when the fleet arrived in several months. And she said Jake needed to understand his fear, but his sister worked in intelligence and she would know how to verify the information properly and how to move it up the chain securely, and she was his best chance at stopping this invasion. And Jake ran his hands through his hair in frustration and started pacing again. And he asked when the fleet was supposed to arrive exactly. And Vera said 6 months from now and maybe less if the infiltration proceeded ahead of schedule. And Jake repeated 6 months and looked at Vera, really looked at her. And the alien girl who had been shivering in the rain a few hours ago now sat calmly on his couch, having just revealed a galactic conspiracy to him. And he asked why he should believe any of this at all. And for all he knew, this was the actual manipulation, and she was the scout, and this was her mission, to make some random human think there was a conspiracy. So they would panic and turn on each other, and Vera met his eyes steadily and said, that would be an extremely inefficient strategy for an invasion, and Jake said, but it was possible. And Vera said anything was possible in theory. And she stood and walked to the door slowly, and she said she had told him what she knew. And the device contained proof of everything. And what he did with it was his choice alone. And she said she could leave now if he wished and disappear back into the rain, and he would never see her again. And she placed her hand on the doorknob, and Jake realized she actually meant it completely. And she was giving him an out from this situation. And he said, wait. And Vera paused with her hand still on the doorknob, and Jake asked if he did this and if he contacted Katie, what would happen to Vera, and she said if his authorities believed the information, they would want to find her and question her extensively, and she would likely spend the rest of her life in a detention facility, assuming they did not simply execute her as an enemy combatant. And Jake asked if she was okay with that outcome, and Vera smiled sadly and said it was better than the alternative, and better than watching his world burn and knowing she did nothing to stop it. And she said she did not expect forgiveness for what her people planned to do, and she did not expect mercy for her role in the early reconnaissance mission, and she only wanted to do one thing right before the end came. And Jake made his decision in that moment and said okay, and he would call Katie, but Vera was not disappearing into the rain, and she was staying here where he could keep an eye on her. And Vera asked if he trusted her that much, and Jake admitted no, but he trusted that she was cold and hungry and genuine when she accepted his pizza earlier, and he trusted that anyone who was willing to sacrifice themselves to save a species they barely knew was probably telling the truth. And even if it was a really inconvenient truth to hear, and Vera's expression softened into something almost like hope, and she said, thank you, Jake Morrison. And Jake said not to thank him yet, and if this went wrong, they were both dead. And he reached for his phone and pulled up Katie's contact information and stared at it for a long moment before pressing the call button. And Katie Morrison arrived at Jake's apartment exactly 1 hour later. And she was out of uniform and clearly trying to look casual. But Jake knew his sister well enough to see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes scanned the hallway carefully before she entered his apartment. And she said as he closed the door behind her that this better be good, and he sounded like he was having a breakdown on the phone earlier. And Jake said this was Vera and gestured to the Kalari girl who stood by the window, and he said she was one of the aliens who arrived 3 months ago, and she had information about an invasion that was coming. And Katie's hand moved instinctively toward her hip, where Jake knew she usually carried a sidearm, but finding nothing there, she instead positioned herself between Jake and Vera protectively, and she told them to start talking and to do it slowly and carefully. And Vera repeated her story again, though more concisely this time, and she explained everything about the Kalari Empire and the infiltration and the coming fleet. And Katie listened without interruption at all, and her expression grew darker with each revelation Vera shared. And when Vera finished explaining everything, Katie held out her hand and said she wanted the device, and Jake handed it over to his sister. And Katie pulled a small scanner from her pocket and ran it over the Kalari device carefully. And she said it was encrypted but not with any Earth technology at all, and she would need to get this to the lab for analysis. And she looked up at Vera and asked how she knew this was not a trap, and that Vera was not feeding them false information to waste their time while her people advanced their real plan. And Vera said simply that Katie did not know for certain, but the device contained verifiable data and locations of Kalari operatives and schedules of their meetings, and she said Katie should send her people to observe any of those locations at the specified times, and they would see the truth. And Katie was quiet for a moment while thinking about the options. And then she pulled out her phone and made a call, and she said Colonel Andrews, and it was Morrison calling, and she needed a secure line and a data forensics team, and no, not at the base, and she would send him coordinates. And she paused and said, "Sir," she had reason to believe they had a significant security breach and possibly hostile alien intelligence, and she needed this handled quietly until they verified the information. And she listened for a moment and then nodded and said, "Understood." And 1 hour, and she ended the call and looked at Jake and said they were both coming with her, and they had a secure facility where they could examine this data properly. And debrief Vera and Jake said to wait, and that Vera said some officials in the defense committee were compromised. And how did Katie know they could trust Andrews? And Katie said she did not know for certain, but Andrews was not on the list of names Vera gave, and he was one of the few people she trusted completely. Katie's expression softened slightly, and she said, Jake needed to know this was scary, but they had protocols for this kind of situation, and if there really was an infiltration happening, they needed to handle it through proper channels. And Jake said the proper channels that might be compromised already. And Katie said the only channels they had available, and she turned to Vera and asked if she was prepared to come along and answer questions, and probably lots of questions. And Vera said yes without any hesitation in her voice, and they left the apartment 30 minutes later and took Katie's car, and she drove them through the rain-slicked streets toward the outskirts of New Seattle and toward an industrial complex that Jake had passed 1,000 times without really noticing it before. And Katie parked in an underground garage and led them through a series of security doors, and each one required biometric scans to open, and the facility was small, but clearly well-equipped, with advanced technology. And Colonel Andrews met them in a windowless conference room, and he was a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and he looked at Vera with frank curiosity, but no hostility showed on his face. And he said Lieutenant Morrison and told her she had brought him an interesting evening. And Katie said, "Sir," and this was Vera, and she was Kalari, and she claimed to have intelligence about an invasion plot, and she had provided a data device that allegedly contained proof of everything. And Andrews took the device from Katie and examined it carefully, and he said they would analyze this immediately. And in the meantime, he would like to hear everything directly from Vera herself, and he said no detail was too small to mention. And for the third time that day, Vera told her story from the beginning, but now she went deeper into details and provided tactical information about Kalari capabilities and their advanced technology and their psychological warfare strategies that they used. And Andrews listened intently to every word and occasionally asked pointed questions that demonstrated he knew more about the Kalari than Jake would have expected him to know. And as Vera spoke for hours, a team of technicians worked at decrypting and analyzing the data device in another room. And 2 hours into the debriefing, one of them interrupted the session and said Colonel Andrews needed to see something immediately, and they crowded around. A computer screen showing what appeared to be a network diagram with connections, and it had names and photos and locations, all connected by glowing lines, and Jake recognized several of the faces from news broadcasts he had seen, and they were high-ranking officials and military leaders, and even a planetary councilwoman was shown. And Andrews said quietly, this was extensive, and if this was accurate, the infiltration went deeper than anyone had suspected before. And Vera said it was accurate, and she had helped compile some of this information herself before she defected from her mission. And Andrews turned to her and asked why, and why would she turn against her own people like this? And Vera was silent for a moment while thinking, and then said, because she learned that strength was not the same as rightness, and that conquest was not the same as worth. And she said, his people had something. Her empire lost long ago, and it was compassion and humanity, and she would rather die preserving that than live as a monster. And Andrews studied her face carefully, and then nodded slowly and said, Lieutenant Morrison. And he wanted this facility on full security lockdown immediately, and no one in or out without his direct authorization, and they needed to verify as much of this intelligence as possible before they moved forward with any action. And Katie said, sir, and if the compromised, officials were alerted that they were investigating them, and Andrews said he was aware of the risks, and that was why they would move carefully but quickly. And he looked at Jake and said, Mr. Morrison, and he was sorry, but Jake was going to need to stay here until they sorted this situation out, and it was for his own safety as much as security reasons, and Jake said he understood completely. And over the next 12 hours, the facility became a hub of quiet and intense activity everywhere, and teams verified Kalari locations from the data device, and surveillance was set up on the individuals named as compromised, and the device yielded more information with each layer of decryption they completed, and it showed communication logs and strategic plans and even the projected arrival date of the Kalari fleet, and it was 5 months and 11 days from now. And Jake tried to sleep on a cot in one of the side rooms but could not manage it, and his mind kept racing and replaying everything Vera had told him. And around 3 in the morning, he found her in the conference room, and she was staring at the network diagram still displayed on the large screen, and Jake asked if she could not sleep either. And Vera said she did not require as much sleep as humans did, and even when she did sleep, lately she had been having nightmares every time, and Jake asked what the nightmares were about, and Vera said about the moment she first understood what they were doing was wrong, and there was a human child, maybe 7 years old, and she approached Vera in a park one day, curious about her appearance, and she asked if Vera was a fairy from stories, and Vera smiled faintly at the memory, and said the child was so innocent and so full of wonder, and all Vera could think was that in a few months, her people would destroy her world and everything she loved, and that was when she knew she could not go through with the mission. And Jake sat down beside her on the chair and said she was incredibly brave to do this. And Vera said, or incredibly foolish, because her people would be searching for her now, and when they realized she had defected and shared their secrets, and she did not finish the sentence, but Jake understood, and he said they would protect her from harm. And Vera asked if they really would. And once this was over, and once the threat was neutralized, what reason would his people have to keep an alien spy alive? And she said she was still the enemy even if she helped them, and she was still one of the Kalari. And Jake said firmly that she was not the enemy, and she was someone who made an impossible choice because it was the right thing to do, and that was not an enemy but a hero. And before Vera could respond to that, Katie burst into the room suddenly and said they had a problem, and one of the compromised officials named Admiral Cole had just sent out an encrypted message, and their techs intercepted it, and she knew they were investigating everything now. And Andrews appeared behind Katie, and his face was grim, and he said this facility was compromised now, and they needed to evacuate the data and the witness immediately, and Katie demanded how they would do that. And if Cole alerted the Kalari operatives, they could be converging on this location right now. And as if in answer to her question, the lights flickered throughout the facility, and then alarms began to blare everywhere, and a voice crackled over the intercom saying, "Breach in the south, entrance and multiple hostiles," and they were Kalari operatives, and Andrews pulled a weapon from his desk drawer and tossed another one to Katie. Andrews told Katie to get her brother and the witness to the north exit immediately, and there was a secondary vehicle bay there, and she should take his car with authorization code 77 Delta 4 and drive to the secondary facility with coordinates in the vehicle's computer, and Katie said sir, and he should come with them. But Andrews said someone needed to buy them time and secure the data, and he told her to go, and that was an order. And Katie grabbed Jake's arm firmly and said they needed to move now, and they ran through the corridors quickly, and Vera kept pace easily despite her slighter build. And behind them, Jake heard the sound of weapons fire echoing through the facility, and the facility had become a war zone in minutes, and they burst through the north exit into a small garage area, and Katie's hands shook as she entered Andrew's authorization code into the vehicle system, and the car hummed to life with power, and she ordered them to get in right now, and they piled into the vehicle quickly, and Katie hit the accelerator hard and they shot out into the pre-dawn darkness, and behind them, the facility lit up with more weapons fire and explosions, and Jake gasped and asked what just happened back there. And Vera said with a hollow voice that the Kalari sent a kill team to stop them, and they knew she had betrayed them now. And they would not stop until she was dead and the data was destroyed completely. And Katie gripped the steering wheel tighter and said, then they would not let them catch up, and they disappeared into the city as the first light of dawn began to break over. New Seattle and the secondary facility was a reinforced bunker, built into the mountains outside the city, and it was designed to withstand everything from nuclear strikes to full-scale alien invasion. And by the time they arrived safely, Katie had received confirmation that Colonel Andrews and most of his team had survived the attack, though the facility had been severely damaged in the fighting, and the bunker's commander was General Marcus Chen, and he met them at the entrance, and he was younger than Jake expected, maybe mid-40s, with an intensity that suggested he had seen his share of combat. And he said Lieutenant Morrison, and he had been briefed on the situation already. And he looked at Vera with clinical interest and said, so she was the defector they had heard about, and Vera said yes simply. And Chen said good, because they had a lot of questions for her. And he turned to Jake and said he was Jake Morrison, the civilian who started all this by giving her pizza. And Jake said weakly that was him. And Chen said interesting, and gestured for them to follow him inside. And he led them into a command center filled with displays and personnel working frantically at computer stations, and on the main screen was an updated version of the network diagram, now showing even more connections than before. And Chen continued talking and said they had teams working through the night to verify the intelligence, and he was sorry to say that everything checked out completely, and the infiltration was real, and it was extensive, and it went higher than they thought possible. And he said they had identified 37 confirmed Kalari operatives in positions of influence, and another 73 suspected operatives in various supporting roles, and they had been building this network for months without detection. And Jake asked what they were going to do about it, and Chen said they were implementing a coordinated arrest operation, and every confirmed operative would be taken into custody simultaneously, before they could alert each other or their fleet, and it was scheduled to happen in 4 hours from now. And Vera asked quietly what would happen after that. And Chen looked at her and said then they would prepare for war, because once they arrested their operatives, the Kalari Empire would know their infiltration failed, and they would either attack immediately or withdraw and try again elsewhere. And Vera said with certainty they would attack, because the Empire did not accept failure, and they would come with everything they had. And Chen pulled up another display showing Earth's orbital defenses, and said they had been building up their capabilities for decades, preparing for possible hostile contact, and they were not defenseless at all. And Vera said with pain in her voice that they were not prepared for the Kalari, and she had seen what the fleet could do in battle. And his weapons and his defenses were impressive by Earth standards, but against an empire that had conquered 47 worlds, they would need more than impressive, and they would need miracles to survive. And the room fell silent at her words, and Chen's jaw tightened. But he did not argue with her assessment, and instead he said, then she would help them prepare those miracles. And she knew their tactics and their technology and their weaknesses and everything she knew. They needed to know immediately, and Vera promised she would tell them everything she knew. But Chen must understand that even with all the information she could provide, Earth's chances were not good at all, and the Kalari had resources and experience and ruthlessness that his people could not match easily. And Katie spoke up for the first time since they arrived, and said maybe they could not match those things. But they had something the Kalari did not have, and it was the will to fight for their home. And the Kalari were fighting for resources, but humans were fighting for survival, and that counted for something important. And Vera looked at Katie with something like admiration, and said, perhaps it did count for something. And over the next 4 hours, Vera underwent intensive debriefing, and Jake and Katie waited in an adjacent room. And Jake watched through the glass as military strategists questioned her about Kalari ship configurations and weapon capabilities and command structures, and she answered every question without hesitation, sometimes sketching diagrams and sometimes pulling up data on the computer systems they gave her access to. And Jake said quietly, she was really doing it and giving them everything she knew. And Katie replied, she was saving their lives, and maybe all of their lives. And she looked at her brother and said, He did good by trusting her and calling Katie. And if he had walked past her in the rain and if he had ignored her, everything would be different, and Jake admitted he almost did walk past and he was tired and wet. And he wanted to just go home and pretend he did not see her at all. And Katie said, but he did not do that, and he offered her food, and something simple, and human and kind, and that changed everything for everyone. And through the glass, they watched as General Chen asked Vera another question, and she paused and then answered at length with a grave expression. And Katie asked what Jake thought would happen to Vera after all this was over, and Jake asked the same question. And Katie was quiet for a moment and said she did not know, and technically, Vera was an enemy combatant who participated in reconnaissance for an invasion, but she also defected and provided intelligence that could save billions of lives, and it was unprecedented, and Jake said firmly that Vera should be given asylum and protected because she risked everything to do the right thing. And Katie said she agreed, but it was not her decision to make. And at exactly 0600 hours, the coordinated arrest operation began across Earth, and military and intelligence teams simultaneously moved on the identified Kalari operatives everywhere, and Jake and Katie watched it unfold on the command center displays, seeing locations light up green as arrests were confirmed, and 37 operatives were taken into custody within the first hour, and 71 by the second hour. And some resisted, and some tried to escape. But Earth's forces had the element of surprise, and Vera's intelligence had been precise and accurate, and by the third hour, the network was completely dismantled, and Chen said, standing before the main display, that now came the hard part. And in approximately 6 hours, the Kalari fleet would reach their system and discover that their infiltration had failed. And at that point, they would have a choice to either press the attack or withdraw. And Vera said again they would attack because it was not in their nature to retreat from anything. And Chen said, then they would show them what happened when anyone underestimated humanity, and the waiting was agonizing for everyone. And military forces across the planet went to high alert status, and orbital defense platforms charged their weapons, and every ship in Earth's small but growing space fleet launched and took defensive positions around the planet, and Jake stayed close to Vera, sensing that she needed the support, and she stood rigidly with her silver eyes fixed on the displays, watching for the moment that would determine the fate of two civilizations. And at 1347 hours, the alarms sounded throughout the facility,